Hi guys, a couple of months ago I went along to an event at Keats House which was hosted by the Foreword Arts Foundation, and it was called How Not to Be a Poetry Critic. It was a panel discussion between poets and poetry critics, and the poets were made out of spoken word poets, so poets who write primarily to be heard, and page poets, so poets who write primarily to be read. It was a really fascinating evening, and it was hosted by Susanna Herbert, who runs the Foreword Arts Foundation, and she was asking us to think of what comes to mind now when we use the word good with regard to poets and poetry in the age of the internet. Hello. And when we read things perhaps quickly, we can share them quickly in our social media circles. And she asked if I would take this question away and talk about it with you guys, which I said I absolutely would. So hello, if you're new here, my name is Jen. I am an author, a writer, a poet. I have a collection out called The Hungry Ghost Festival, published by the Rialto. I won an Eric Gregory Award this year, and at the moment I'm currently judging the Costa Book Awards, the poetry category. So the question of what constitutes a good poet or good poem is a question that I'm thinking about a lot right now. Obviously, if we're talking about what constitutes a good poet or a good poem, we have to say who gets to decide that. And one of the people on the panel was Jeremy Noel Todd, who is a Sunday Times critic. He showed us this positive review that he had done for a poetry collection, and beneath it someone had commented saying, "Oh, so you liked this book, did you? Just like all the rest."
I bet you didn't like this as much as you implied. And actually it's that second point which really makes me wince.
Jeremy was talking about space for poetry. Does that mean that he hasn't been reading things that he didn't like? No, but as a book reviewer in a national newspaper, if you are only allowed the space to talk about one poetry book a week or a month, are you going to use that space to talk about something that wasn't to your taste? No. You use that limited space for poetry to talk about something that you really want to shout about. If we look at something else like BookTube, like book blogs, where the reviewers control the space that they have, I can make videos on whatever I want to make, and that doesn't mean that you're going to watch them. Obviously, we don't have, as book reviewers, the immediate platform that a new writer to the Sunday Times would have. We don't have that platform to begin with. We have to build up our audience, but at least we get to control the space where we talk about what books we like or don't like, and therefore we have the space to talk about as many things as we want to. And if we want to use our space to talk about things that we have enjoyed and not enjoyed, we have the freedom to do that as well. Some people might say that a person running a book blog or a BookTube channel might not have the background knowledge to talk about the things that they are talking about, and we get into a very sticky situation here. I always think that it's important to want to know more, to do with whatever it is that we're talking about. It's always great to want to know more, to learn more, but that doesn't mean also that we can't have an opinion about something that we have read. And if you say that someone can't have an opinion on something that they have read, then that creates a sort of elitism and opens up a whole can of worms. And we could sit here and talk about access to arts and access to education. We could talk about a whole host of things. Equally, we could have conversations, and did have conversations that evening at Keats House, about how we contextualize something, because book reviewers in the press are generally white, straight, middle-aged men. I'm going to leave a link down below to statistics so you can go and look at book reviewers, the things that they review, and also literary journals and the things that they publish, and the balance or imbalance of gender and race. So go and have a look at those below. So if the majority of people are white men talking about all kinds of books, how can we contextualize these things? Last year, Citizen by Claudia Rankine was everywhere. Can we contextualize that poetry properly in the mass media of national newspapers and book reviews if everyone who's talking about it is a white man? So as you can see, there are many different ways that we can talk about someone having the authority to speak on a matter. Is it the person who's read the most surrounding that topic? Is it the person who has the best education background? Is it someone who has experience of things that the poems are speaking about? We could argue for all of these different things. For instance, if someone has read Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter but doesn't know that the character of Crow in that comes from Ted Hughes's Crow, does that matter? And if you're going to say yes, then we could go further and ask that reviewer, okay, do you know all of his work? Have you read everything? Do you know about his life? Does that matter? Does the work of Max Porter stand on its own? Does it stand away from its own author and the other authors that it's referencing? Yes and no. Art exists in many different spheres at the same time. And when we're talking about what constitutes as something good and who has the authority to say what something good is, it depends what we're approaching a book review for. Are we looking for a literary analysis, or are we looking to talk to a friend who's going to press a good book into our hands? And I would argue that on Booktube you can find both of those things, sometimes simultaneously, depending on what channels you are looking at. Same obviously for book blogs, etc., and newspapers and the mass media. Going back to what constitutes a good poem. Some of the speakers on the evening brought up this idea that they feel that sometimes if they criticise a poem, they're criticising the poet, and they don't often feel that way if they're reviewing, say, a work of fiction or non-fiction. Poetry has that personal edge to it. The I in poetry almost always feels like it comes from the author. That's not right, and we know that that's not right, but we can't help it. Poetry is emotive. It makes us feel that personal touch, especially if you are listening to spoken word poetry. That person is reading that work to you. It has that immediate response, and also you have to decide whether or not you like it immediately. One of the speakers at the event was Peter Kahn, who is a spoken word educator. During the evening, Peter told us very moving stories about teenagers that he has taught who have gone on to write amazing poetry, who've won prizes, but who weren't approaching poetry by means of studying it, by looking at past forms and voices, but who were using poetry as a vessel to express themselves and channel their emotions and ultimately save themselves and create these beautiful, moving poems that were raw. And really, if we're going to talk about what is good about poetry, what is better than that?
Well, for me, poetry has more to do with the impact it's had on students than it has on me personally. So I've seen poetry transform my students' lives, and in some instances save their lives. So to me, poetry is an ally. A slam poem is typically going to be 3 minutes in length and is meant to be heard and understood in one viewing, so to speak, right? So it can't be poured over. So there might be layers to it, but it has to be accessible, immediately accessible, or it's not going to work. While a page poem doesn't have to be. It can be poured over and read and reread.
Interestingly, another part of the discussion was brought up by spoken word poet Paula Varjak. She was voicing some of her frustration with aspects of the spoken art world. She was saying that she would sometimes meet spoken word poets who didn't read poetry, who didn't go to the theatre, who didn't listen to music, who didn't go see films, who weren't absorbing any other art forms apart from the ones that they themselves were creating. And these poets would then sit together and praise each other without really criticising anything. And I have encountered that before myself as well, speaking to people who say they want to be published poets, but who do not read poetry, which I just cannot get my head around. Writing is inevitably linked with reading. Reading makes us better poets. The more that we absorb, the more we learn, the more we grow. It's very ignorant to think that we can become good all on our own, and that people should appreciate that if we're not taking the time to look outside ourselves as well. The final poet who was there, who was speaking, was a poet called Duhigg, and he said that he actually reads more poetry criticism than he does other poetry. He says reading poetry criticism and poetry reviews makes him a better poet. Now, I have had experience of this myself. People tell you as an author not to read your reviews, and mostly I pay attention to this. But with regard to poetry reviews, as we were saying before, poetry is reviewed so infrequently that if I get a poetry review, I have to go and look at it. I cannot help myself. And I really remember one review that I had once on the Sphinx, and I'm going to read you an extract of it here. This is what the review said, part of it anyway. It says, "Campbell brings me right inside her head. Her writing is luminous, immediate, and magical. I imagine she fell in love with words early, spinning them into shining nets to save herself from a kind of drowning. She's a real poet, in other words. But if I hadn't been asked to review this, I might not have had the persistence to stay with these poems long enough to appreciate them. I need more signposts to help me make sense of these memories of hers. Dear Miss Campbell, I want to tell her, take pity. The first few drafts are for you, but all the rest are for me." And I have not forgotten that piece of advice. In fact, it's now a piece of advice that I quote to my students. So yes, as a writer, the first draft of something that you write is for you. And then during the next few drafts, you have to think about your audience. You have to get outside your own head and think critically about what you're doing and think about your audience and what you're saying to them and what they know and what they can deduce. And earlier in my career, that's something I didn't do as much as I should have done. And reading that review has made me a better poet. So in this situation, what constitutes a good poem? It's something that reaches inside the writer and inside the reader and pulls them together, and it's the space where they meet in the middle and share ideas.
It's basically a space where the reader and writer are in, they've got a shared attention. Both of them are present.
One of the greatest things about reading books and reading wildly is that you come across stuff that you think, oh my god, I've had that thought. Yeah. And when someone executes that so well, then that's one of the great joys of reading, I think.
So it's this shared space?
I would say so, yeah.
Would you say someone who's quite new to poetry, say someone who's been scared away from it at school, and they think that there is a correct way to read a poem, and if they read something and they don't understand it, they feel like maybe they're reading it wrong?
I think just try and enjoy the language. I think in terms of, I guess, what you have in education now is a set of a canon, which all children are given Caroline Duffy. There's so much more out there, so just read widely.
A good place to start is your own local poetry scene, which case there is like this really good grassroots level of stuff, so you'll have like that immediately shared experience already present in a lot of communities. You just have to go out looking for them and just be curious.
So how do we go about writing a good poem then, and noticing a good poem? Does that mean that a good poem always looks the same? Absolutely not. I have made many videos talking about my favourite poetry collections. I'll leave a poetry playlist link down below. I've also started a new series called Dissect a Poem. The first episode is here. In this series, we look at a specific poem in each episode and we talk about what is in this poem that makes it work, what makes it a good poem, and we look at the elements specific to that individual piece. So if you'd like to go and check that out, you can click here. So as I said, I want this to be a conversation. I want to talk with you about what makes a good poem, and we can do that in the comment section down below. But before I made this video, I also asked on Twitter what constitutes a good poem, and here are some of your answers. Hayley Sprout said, it hits you in the gut. Claire Maxwell said, it's one that stirs emotions, bad or good. Writer Helen McGlory said, a good poem needs to use metaphors wisely. Lamorna, who works at Granta, says it needs space for the reader's imagination. Robin Gustafson said, my favourite poems surprise me and make me feel as if the poet is speaking directly to my experience. Gwendolyn Harrison said, good poetry has a pulse. Two of our lovely YouTubers here, Tessa Violet, said, it surprises me with words I didn't know I wanted to feel. And Sophie Carlon said, it presses on what hurts. The more forgotten the hurt unearthed, the better the poem. Now, the Foreword Arts Foundation do lots of things to forward the world of poetry puns, and they also run National Poetry Day. I'll leave a link to their website down below, but what they also run once a year are the Foreword Prizes, and those are 3 prizes. We have the Foreword Prize for Best Collection, published over the previous year, the Felix Dennis Prize for Best First Collection, and the Foreword Prize for Best Single Poem, published in that year. And what they do every year is they publish a book. This is this year's here, the Foreword Book of Poetry 2017, and this includes extracts from all of the shortlisted authors in each category. I've mentioned these series of books before on this channel. I think they're a great access point. You get a wide variety of things in here. And I'll leave a link down below to all of the books that are shortlisted for the Foreword Prize. Ian Duhigg, who I mentioned before, and his poems are rich in literary references. And then you have Melissa Lee Horton, whose poem I Am Very Precious, and that is raw and it runs and runs through the page. So we have so many different kinds of poems here. And not only is this book out here, which I'll link down below, but this year they're celebrating 25 years of the Foreword Prize. So they've got here 100 poems from 25 years of the Foreword books. So not only each year are they picking the best, now they had to pick the best of the best. And I wondered what that was like, because if we're talking about what constitutes as good, you've already done that once. Now you have to do it again out of ones that you've already decided are good. So I was reading the introduction. I had a couple of quotes from the introduction to pull out. He said, on rereading more than 1,600 poems featured in all the Foreword books to date, I'm no closer to knowing what constitutes a stayer, a poem that will last. Good poems grow in the rereading. Anthologists and juries, like expert gardeners, know something of the material they are dealing with, but they cannot know what future eyes will see. It is commonplace to speak of anthologies as bunches of flowers. This one is a bag of seeds. I hope some fall on fertile ground. And I thought that was a really lovely way of thinking about poetry, that you're going to sow some things and some people are going to like them and some people aren't. But what's important is that we come together and talk about it. So I encourage you to get together with some friends to talk about poetry, to take part in the Dissect a Poem series that I've been doing, to get together and to discuss poetry, because when we discuss poetry, that's when it really comes alive, when we gain confidence in saying why we think personally something is good. Leave me comments down below letting me know what you think constitutes a good poem. Tell me about your favourite poets, about the favourite lines, about things that you wish you knew more of, things that now you're going to go out and find. Check out the Foreword Arts Foundation website, go to poetry readings in your local area, learn more about poetry, listen, absorb. The more you absorb, the more you talk about it, the more confident you will feel in picking out what you think is a good poem for you. And once you have discovered what you like, what you think is good, read the hell out of it and tell everyone you know. Lots of bookish love. Bye!